Welcome, parents and families. This is Crystal Strader, Curriculum Facilitator for Middle School Math with Gaston County Schools. For this month's Parent Academy video, we're going to take a look at the distributive property. In this video, we're going to start by understanding how students' understanding of the distributive property progresses from grades 6 through 8. We're also going to look at how the distributive property helps us to make sense of and use that structure and meaning with expressions. And then we'll look at how students apply the distributive property to understand and solve a variety of problems. Students are first exposed to the distributive property when they're working with decomposing numbers. So for example, with 24, I can decompose that into 20 plus 4. And I'm using that to simplify the multiplication process. So even though a student may not know what 6 times 24 is and may not be able to do that computation mentally, if we decompose that number, then we know that 6 times 20 is 120, and 6 times 4 is 24. So then we know that the product of 6 times 24 is the same thing as 120 plus 24, which is 144. Students build off of that to begin decomposing expressions in 6th grade. In 6th grade, students look at expressions like 12 plus 18. Now we know very simply that 12 plus 18 is 30. However, what they begin looking at is trying to understand structure in expressions. So they're going to look at the greatest common factor between 12 and 18. So that which we abbreviate as GCF. So the greatest common factor between 12 and 18 would be 6. So what they look at is that we know that if we divide both of those by 6, so 12 divided by 6 is 2, 18 divided by 6 is 3. So we know that 12 plus 18 is the same thing as 6 times 2 plus 3. Now we know that 2 plus 3 is 5, and 6 times 5 is 30. Now at this stage, it seems a little silly. It's extra work to decompose this expression to do the multiplication, to perform the multiplication this way. However, it helps us to begin to understand structure. So when we move to 7th grade, we're looking at using that distributive property to understand structure and to make meaning of expressions. So here students are looking at areas of 2 rectangles that have been put together. And they're looking to see, is the area, another student has said that the area of those 2 rectangles combined, the total area is 6b plus 3b. And so what we look at, based on what we know, that the area of a rectangle is equal to its length times its width. So what both of these rectangles have in common are this, what I'm going to call the length. So here we know that what this would have in common, what these 2 rectangles would have in common, would have to be that b, which means that the width of the larger rectangle is 6, and the width of that smaller rectangle is 3, because we know that 6 times length times width, or length times width, 6 times b is 6b, 3 times b is 3b. So we can also look at how we know that the area of those 2 rectangles combined would be equivalent to b times 6 plus 3. Well, 6 plus 3 is 9, and 9 times b is 9b, which is the same thing as what this student got over here. So we're starting to really understand that whether we're decomposing or putting expressions together, we're understanding that structure and how those components of that expression relate to this area model. Now that students are more comfortable with working with that distributive property, whether it's to distribute or it's to simplify and factor out, like what we did with the GCF, in 7th grade and 8th grade, students are using that distributive property more fluently to solve equations. So here they're using that distributive property to simplify and solve. Same thing in 8th grade, the only difference is that the variable is on both sides. And once they get there, they're solving those equations using those inverse operations. And what this is setting them up for, again, we're using the distributive property more fluently. When they get to high school, they start looking at more advanced expressions. So we were distributing a 6 to 2 terms inside of a parentheses. Well, now we're working with algebraic expressions, and so we're really just performing distribution, the distributive property, twice. So we're distributing both of the terms, so x in this one, in that first expression, and then the 3. And students learn a variety of models to help with that. So here you can see they've performed the distributive property in a line. We also use what looks like a Punnett square from science to help organize that work as well, where they're doing the they're evaluating the distributive property really 4 times. And then here they're using that inverse. They're factoring out that greatest common factor with an expression, and they're using that to solve. So this distributive property helps to build as we move on up into those higher grades as well. Well, we hope you've learned something about the distributive property today, and we want to thank you for watching.